Good evening. This is the welcome to the Wednesday, December 11th meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. I'd like to call the meeting to order, beginning with approval of the minutes from our November 13th meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, changes?
I didn't see. So moved.
Nels,
Second.
and seconded by Joel Hamilton. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Item 2 is an opportunity for members of the public to come up to speak to the commission regarding matters that aren't currently before us or pending before us. And tonight we have a really packed audience, so I don't think that anybody's coming up unless the two of you are. So, but anyway, it's a reminder to the public that it's an opportunity to come speak to us. Item 3 is a public hearing, a proposal for a rezone of a 25,000 square foot area addressed as 904, 908, and 912 South Washington Street within the city of Moscow. And Mike Ray will give us a presentation.
Wendy, I don't know if I need to say it, but that is my bank, but doesn't make any difference. Credit union,
I don't
credit union.
I don't think that would be
I don't think
considered
it make, I don't,
I don't think, maybe if you work for them, it would.
Oh,
be.
okay.
And you were a manager. I think you're all right. So, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners. So before you tonight, we have Latah Credit Union's request for a rezone of their property and recently acquired property to the north. It's 25,000 square feet in size and addressed as 904, 908, and 912 South Washington Street. And the request is to rezone it from its current designation of residential office to the general business zone. Banks and credit unions are no longer permitted in residential office, so after the land use table amendment to the code, pretty much created a nonconformity out of Latah Credit Union in their current location, and so that's one of the reasons why they're requesting a rezone for this property. So this is mainly the area that we're looking at outlined in red. So this is the 25,000 square foot area. The bank is here, or the credit union, excuse me. They have a parking lot to the north. Then they recently acquired a property here, which used to be a single family dwelling, which currently is, but probably sits vacant at the time. And then to the south is their drive-through facility, which is currently in the motor business zone. To the west, we have the Wren Welcome Garden, which is the city of Moscow's. We have parking for Gritman Medical Center, rehabilitation here, as well as rehabilitation building here. And then we have various residential uses to the north and to the east, with Jefferson Street, Lewis Street, and Spotswood Street to the south. And then this is flanked by Washington Street to the west, which is 3 lanes northbound, and it's a national highway. So just a closer view of the property. And looking at the comprehensive plan land use designation, it's currently designated as urban mixed. And then the residential neighborhood to the east is urban residential. Further to the north along the east side of Washington Street is urban mixed as well. And then you have a civic institutional use, which is Gritman Medical Center to the northwest, and obviously Wren Welcome Garden is parks and open space for the city, and then Legacy Crossing, as well as Stubbs Seed Warehouse and Identity to the south are within the urban mix zone as well. So looking at that designation, it's really just intended for infill development and adaptive reuse of areas surrounding downtown. So it calls for a mix of residential, limited commercial, should be promoted through small urban apartments, townhomes, and 2 3-story vertically mixed-use buildings. And it looked to provide a pedestrian connection to the University of Idaho and downtown, and provide for a variety of housing alternatives, niche retail, restaurants, artist studios, and personal and professional services. And then taking a look at off-street parking, it indicates that it should be required, but the number should be reduced just because of the proximity to downtown and the likely number of non-motorized travel this will attract. So looking at the current zoning configuration, like I mentioned before, it's in the residential office, as well as swath of properties here to the north, which are currently used as professional offices. Gritman Medical Center's general business to the west. We have a slight patch of industrial with a Wren Welcome Garden that's just a remnant of a zone that used to be there. Motor business would be the drive-through portion of the property, and then the residential neighborhood to the east is R4, which is multifamily residential. And then the proposal would be to rezone it to general business, so just take the general business zone with Gritman Medical Center and extend that across to the east side of Washington to cover this property. So looking at the general business zone and the zoning code, it's looking to provide for location and grouping of compatible retail enterprises, dispensing commodities, providing professional services, providing personal services to the individual, ones that which do not involve more than incidental or limited assembly, fabrication, or storage of commodities. And then it points you to a couple locations where it's appropriately applied, and the first one's on the periphery of the central business zone, where retail uses are appropriate, yet the distance to community parking facilities indicates the need for on-site parking. And then at dispersed commercial centers, where grouping of retail and office uses is appropriate to serve community or regional needs. And there is existing water mains and sewer mains within Washington Street and Lewis Street, and as well as Spotswood. And they do have adequate capacity for any future development on this property. And then to the west is Washington, like I mentioned before, National Highway, 3 northbound lanes, and it does have curb gutter sidewalks on both sides of the street. And then just a quick review of our rezone criteria, consistency with the comp plan, logical and orderly location of land uses, community services, uses expected to occur are compatible with the surrounding area. It's not going to place any undue burden of services by any political subdivision or planning jurisdiction. And then the size, type, and density of development can be adequately served by the existing transportation network, public facilities, and services. And the applicant did conduct a neighborhood meeting. All those materials are attached to your packet, and that happened on November 14th of this year. And staff's recommendation is, after considering conducting the public hearing and considering public testimony, I recommend approval of the proposed rezone to City Council with no conditions, and then direct staff to prepare the RCS document. I'd certainly be able to answer any questions you have.
Yes, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I just go back to the one of the plans. I just clarify from my old mind. Okay, the bank has to own that next piece of land, but that's the zone changes right at the red line.
It does, yeah.
And so it's what, R4 then on the corner? Isn't that odd?
This is motor business, so it's more of a transition to the highway corridor as you transition into downtown. Really, the main reason the request wasn't made for this property as well is that drive-through facilities are allowed by right in motor business. General business, it requires a conditional use permit.
Boy, the bureaucracy has gotten really picky here, if I don't mind saying so. Okay, I presumed that's what you were going to say, but thank you.
Okay, good question. Other questions? Anybody? All right, so thank you, Mike. I guess with that, we'll open the public hearing, and is there anyone here to represent the applicant? Scott Becker.
Hi, Scott Becker with Hodgen Associates at 405 South Washington. And I just want to thank Mike and the staff for the work they did in getting this rezone application, everything put together and helping us through that process. Through the neighborhood meeting, we had people show up. We just had 2 people show up, and I think they were more interested in Halloween than they were in what we were doing. So anyway, it went really well. Nobody was opposed to it. We really just are trying to be conforming to what the city's requirements are. If you have any questions, I'd gladly answer them. The president and CEO of Latah Federal Credit Union is here also if you have questions for her. Marlis Wilson.
Okay, anybody have any questions for the applicants?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. And I suppose you're not here to speak in opposition? Or of a general nature, if you want to make any comments? Okay, well, with that, I'll close the public hearing and go back to discussion. Is there any final comments, or does anybody want to move forward with approval and recommendation for council?
Well, I move that we recommend to council the approval of the proposal.
Okay, all in favor?
Second.
I second it.
Oh, second, thank you. Jet lag there.
With the relevant criteria and all that, yeah.
Yeah, well, first, right, and that would come usually next, and then we have to approve the relevant. So first, we need to approve the.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, at least, I think so. All in favor of the, rezone application?
Aye.
Opposition? Okay, and do you want to go ahead and make that motion for the relevant, right? Okay. We need somebody to direct staff to prepare them.
I move that we direct staff to prepare a statement of relevant criteria and standards.
Second.
Okay, thank you, I'll let Dennis second that one. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. All right, so that's item 3. Moving, thank you. We're not going to have anybody here for the fourth item?
The meeting gets really good later.
Item 4 is also a public hearing. It's a legislative hearing providing for the amendment of Title VI, Chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the Moscow City Code regarding amendments to the mobile home parks and recreation vehicle parks chapters. So Mike Ray will give a presentation.
So thank you again. So this is the ongoing project that we've been working on this year for the revision of the mobile home park, manufactured home park, and RV park chapters of the code. And just to give a little bit of background, on August 22nd of 2018, the commission approved a proposal for an RV spaces within ABL Mobile Home Park, and that was at 603 West Palouse River Drive. At the time, Mr. Lester indicated that there were a number of spaces within the park that were too small to accommodate newer manufactured homes, and the commission approved those for RV spaces. And then there were a number of spaces that he was looking at transitioning to RVs, and then within 3 to 5 years, and transitioning back to manufactured homes. And then shortly after that, on November of 2018, we received a letter from Mr. Lester requesting that the Planning and Zoning Commission explore removing the 6-month stay limitation for occupancy of RV parks. The commission ended up discussing the request of January of this year and February of this year, and directed staff to prepare an amendment to remove the current 6-month limitation. And the commission also discussed providing greater opportunities for tiny houses within manufactured home parks. So we currently have 2 chapters that address manufactured and mobile home parks. We have the new mobile home park chapter, we have the existing mobile home park chapter. And both chapters, as well as RV park chapter, have not been updated since the early 80s. And then there is a number of updates that needed to happen that have occurred at the federal and state level regarding definitions primarily, and HUD, that needed to update the other portions of the code. And so it really turned into almost a complete rewrite of all those 3 chapters. And then the current structure of having the 2 chapters for mobile home parks, the new chapter and the existing chapter, was just really confusing and created redundant language in our code. So the changes that have happened in the draft ordinance were that the manufactured home park chapters have been merged, so Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And then we updated a number of definitions to be consistent with federal and state definitions. So the definition of manufactured home, and it all relies on that date that HUD started inspecting manufactured homes, which happened in '76, and so everything After 76 is a manufactured home. Everything before would be declared a mobile home. So we updated those definitions and then added the definition of a modular home, which is more or less a building that doesn't meet the definition of a manufactured or mobile home. It could be a tiny home that's not on wheels or a chassis would be a modular home. And Idaho State Division of Building Safety is the entity that inspects and approves modular homes. And then updating manufactured home park to include all of those types of housing. And then throughout the chapter, obviously we needed to update the current language of manufactured home and replace mobile home, which was what it was referred to before. And then looking at the preliminary and final plat process, we ended up just updating the digital submission requirements instead of requiring all the copies of paper that we had before. Just updating to current technology, eliminating really a detailed internal review process that didn't really need to be spelled out. And we had the awkward language about forwarding to council. With this proposal, it would just be final approval through P&Z, which is similar to RV parks. And then standards for manufactured homes. So we inserted kind of a new heading. That was really the only difference between the two chapters, the existing mobile home park chapter and the new mobile home park chapter. Was just the bulk and dimensional standards, how far you have to be away from other manufactured homes and property lines, things of that nature. Access drives would come into play as well. So we just incorporated those two within the revised chapter. And then we reorganized sections that were just really standards. So we had the recreation area, buffer area, streets and roads, private streets, walkways, lighting, parking, utilities, refuse handling, space numbering, skirting. All those were just broken into different sections to make it clear. And then added the definition of modular home, and just to be clear, said that modular homes that have been inspected and approved through DBS, which contain the appropriate modular insignia, shall be permitted within manufactured home parks to allow for those tiny homes that aren't on wheels and a chassis. And then getting to the RV park code, added the definition of a park model RV, which since the code that was written in the 80s didn't include a park model RV, and that was a definition that was taken from the state where they define an RV at that level. They also have a park model as well, which is a relatively newer phenomenon in the last 10, 15 years. And then similar to the manufactured home park chapters, we updated the preliminary and final plats for electronic submission. And then the crux of this would be the length of the stay in the RV park. We eliminated the length of stay limitation for RVs with full hookups within RV parks. So with that, after conducting the public hearing, consideration of testimony received, staff recommends, the commission recommend approval of the proposed ordinance to city council with no conditions. Certainly be able to answer any questions. Yeah.
I have one, Mike, and I can't remember why we don't include a definition of tiny homes in this as well. Would it make sense to?
Well, because tiny homes really fall under either RVs or modular homes. Is what,
Okay.
how it happens.
Okay. Because it's becoming such a common terminology, and so somebody coming into the, looking at the code would go, where does, if I want to build a tiny home, where does it fall, and that I guess.
Well, I have the same question, and we have a definitions section. I don't know, maybe we couldn't put that in there.
Well, a tiny home, there's multiple ways you can create a tiny home. So a tiny home on wheels and a chassis is declared an RV. So it has to be declared an RV. We can't call it something else. Modular home that's constructed off-site and is of, that size of a tiny home is a modular building. A tiny home is really if you were to define it, it'd be a stick-built building, which now is not a manufactured home or a modular home or a mobile home or an RV.
So can it be itself then? I mean, a distinct,
Well, could you have something like there are a number of kinds of tiny homes which may or may not apply to either of these sections?
right?
The question is, though,
Go ask
is
somebody.
why? We don't know what the definition of a tiny home is. We don't have a definitive square footage is tiny and this one's the next bigger. It has several different descriptions of how it's made or how it's moved or how it's put in. The tiny home is fairly arbitrary and it's a big term for a little house. So I can see where you get very convoluted to try and put that in all of its
Well, yeah, I wouldn't want to put it in all of it.
terminology.
It's just
You'd have to have pages more.
because we know we've had at least one inquiry in terms of a tiny home going into a manufactured home park. So, for the public out there, they're going to look at all this and they're going to say, where's tiny home? And, and it just something, a note that said,
Seems like.
go ask Mike.
Seems like what
Or
we
something.
probably should do is just put it into our mental bank as something to pay attention to. And it'd be, once somebody wants to do a tiny home, a few of them in our town, it'll bring it back to us.
Well, it'd probably be good just to have an informational sheet at our office that said where are tiny homes allowed,
Absolutely.
and that would
Grand
kind of
idea.
give.
And
give
what
the-
are they? Because they can be
Give
accessory
the
dwellings.
break, give
Yeah.
the breakdown of, the different types and where they could be
Yeah.
permitted. But after the conversation last time, we did add, on park model recreational vehicle, so this is page 16 of the ordinance. So it gives examples of what the typical park model is, and includes park models, park trailers, recreational park trailers, and then I added in certain tiny homes at the end of that.
I remember reading it in here, that's why I wondered why it wasn't in the definitions.
That was just based upon, I think, last time we discussed this.
Yeah.
That the commission wanted to insert that there, but, yeah, I think it'd just be good to have an informational sheet at our office that goes through, the different types of tiny homes and where they're permitted within the city.
Yeah, okay,
I
that's a
think
good
it'd be
idea.
the best way to do it.
Other questions on this amendment of Title VI? Anybody? Well, is anybody prepared to make a motion to approve the amendment of Title VI, Chapters 2, 3, and 4?
Do we need to
Open the public
Oh,
hearing.
thank you, but there's nobody, yeah, I forgot. Okay, so I am still in Cabo mentally or something, not enough sleep. Anyway, apologies there. So with that, I will open the public hearing, and there is no one present to discuss the matter, so I will turn around and close it. And now open to we need some audience to keep my memory on track here. Anyway, so at this point, I think we're prepared to entertain a
I'll
motion
make
unless.
a motion that we recommend approval of the ordinance
Okay,
for City Hall.
I'll second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Motion carries, and there's no relevant criteria or standards for a legislative ordinance, so we will move on to item 5. So this is the subdivision committee, review committee's recommendations that you're going to be discussing, Mike's going to be discussing.
Yeah, so this is just a report on, or I guess I'm forwarding the recommendations on behalf of the Subdivision Review Committee for our subdivision ordinance. And so just a little bit of backtracking here. The commission ended up finalizing our draft subdivision code in July of this year. We ended up forming the Subdivision Review Committee to review and provide recommendations. This is more of the stakeholder group. We had a subdivision developer, a civil engineer, and a land use attorney, as well as two P&Z members, Wendy and Rob, who were gracious enough to sit on the committee. And they met on October 18th of this year and November 15th of this year, and were able to go through the entire document and give a recommendation. We met on the noon hour, and each meeting was about an hour and a half long. So the first, and I've got as part of your packet, I've got their recommendation. We've got the subdivision ordinance, and then all of their recommendations are highlighted in kind of legislative format in red in that sheet. So the first one is related to lot division, the lot division process. So I'll just go back through what we were planning on doing with the lot division process. And so right now, we had talked about before, it's currently within an odd place. It's our construction regulations, which is Title VII, which is not in the subdivision code, it's not in the zoning code. It's in the portion of the code that talks about amending the International Building Code. So it's always been in this odd location. It really just has this brief process about dividing lots that are pretty much 4 lots or less with a lot division. And it has to comply with the following. It has to comply with the appropriate zoning classification, so lot size, lot width. Also has to comply with like bulk and dimensional standards. So if there's an existing house on the property, it has to comply with setback requirements. And then it kind of goes through this process and defines it by saying that the lot division is referred to council. Council refers it to the building official, who then requests for compliance with applicable ordinance, and then the building official decides what the outcome should be, and then it's reviewed by Public Works Finance Committee of the council, and then forwarded on to the full city council, which ends up, the last part of that ends up happening. But it's always this odd process because there's a public meeting at the Public Works Finance Committee, and it's quasi-judicial, but there's only 3 counselors there. And then it gets forwarded up to the full council, which isn't a public meeting, but if there's people there to testify, they still can. So it just creates this real awkward process, and it's pretty confusing and awkward for everybody involved. So, and everybody within 600 feet gets notified of the division request. So we kind of talked about this. It may, forward to the full council as a consent or regular agenda item. Usually just depends on how much input we get at the Public Works Finance Committee level. And then the council may take public comment, but they're not obligated to do so. And then we talked about, ultimately does not create a new parcel, but rather permission to issue building permits for that property. Really, the only way to create a new parcel per se is to go through the subdivision plat process. And there's also no survey or monumentation. So licensed surveyors aren't required to prepare the documents. They're not required to prepare all the corner pins and the monumentation. So any homeowner can pretty much pull this process off on their own. We also have a potential conflict with our subdivision definition and process. So our subdivision definition is essentially any lot in town qualifies as a subdivision. And so if we're having 4 lots go through this process, technically it would still meet our definition of a subdivision. So we've got a conflict there. So what we had proposed to do was to define lot division as creating no more than 1 additional lot eligible for a building permit. And so, you have an existing lot, and you create another one, you're essentially creating 2 lots out of it. And so going down from 4 pretty much to 2 lots. And the request, instead of the council, it goes to the zoning administrator, who forwards it over to the city engineer, fire marshal, building official. We were proposing to send it out to all property owners within 600 feet of the property to allow them to submit 15-day written comment. And then after consideration of all comments received, zoning administrator shall, approve the division as requested, approve with conditions or revisions, or deny the proposed division. And then they'll mail, or our department, zoning administrator, mails notice of the decision to the applicant and all property owners within 600 feet. provides a summary of the decision and process and the deadline for submission of an appeal. And then the appeal process, any affected person may appeal the administrator's decision to city council within 15 days of being notified. And then the zoning administrator's decision shall not be final until the expiration of the appeal period and submission of the record of survey. So, it's really shifting to more of a hearings examiner process. And, it's taking, previously it allowed up to 4 lots, but you had to go through, this public meeting, kind of public hearing process at the council level. And so, it's making it easier in the sense that, the zoning administrator makes the decision. You don't have to come to a public meeting unless it gets appealed. And in lieu of that, we're, reducing it to 1 to account for that. But looking at the committee's recommendations, they would like to keep the division to 4 lots instead of 1 additional lot. And they wanted to reduce the notification distance from 600 to 300 feet. I think before, in the draft, the first draft that we shared with the commission, it was 300 feet. But just working through the commission, I think we increased it to 600. And the reason was just to be consistent with all the other processes that we require 600 feet. So like conditional uses, rezone, subdivision plats, we all require 600 feet for the notification distance. And so that was really the main reason why we chose the 600, as I recall, at the commission level. State code only requires 300 feet, but we've always doubled that to 600 over the years, and that's been in existence for quite a long time.
So question, since we do have all of them at 600 feet, why does the subcommittee want an exception to this to go to 300? Because it doesn't make sense to me.
I wish I had an answer for you. We mostly listened because these are stakeholders from another perspective, from the development, industry, so.
Well, I like consistency.
So it was, do you remember exactly, it was just.
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with just the, 300 feet, I guess the typical block length is 600 feet.
Right.
300 feet would tend to capture, if there was a property that was divided in the middle of the block, 300 feet would tend to capture the entire block. And really, if you're dividing a property and, say, allowing another house to be built, presumably the effects of that additional development shouldn't affect somewhere across town. It should just really affect the immediate
Yeah, but you're
neighbors in the
dividing it up
vicinity.
to 4, not just 1, because that's what it was 1, and now they want to go back to having, it could go to 4 lots. So another reason in my mind to have it 600 feet.
Sure.
Well, it would cover across the street and around the side of the block and,
Yeah,
well, depending on what
yeah.
the configuration of the
Yeah.
neighborhood is. But
So I'm thinking if you go 4 lots, then go 600 feet. I like to be consistent with 600 feet, unless there's a really good reason. That isn't a good enough reason in my mind.
Well, in our mind, I mean, we're shifting this process from, the council's approval to an administrative approval. And the reason we had reduced it to just 1 additional lot was that was really the only, number of lots that we felt comfortable. I mean, I'm going to be the one that's going to be approving these requests. It can be appealed to the council, but, just given the process that we have now and scaling that back to, zoning administrator approval, there's some circumstances where we're creating 4 lots that, should I be the one that's giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to 4 lots?
I would
that's
tend
the-
to agree with
that's the
you.
Yeah, I have to
question.
question that.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously saving some cost and fast-tracking things from the development side, but you have to balance it with the community interest side and, yeah, I mean, staff time in particular. You wouldn't feel comfortable, I take it, particularly.
Well, I mean, there's always a chance to appeal it to city council, and so that's fine. I mean, that's kind of the safety valve, but, I think that our whole idea with this was that, allowing it just to go to administrative approval, it was kind of a give and a take type of thing. We reduced the number from 4 down to the kind of essentially the 2 lots, and we go to administrative to make it easier.
Yeah, and I'm
Then
comfortable with that.
That's kind of the give and the take that we thought was,
Right, or even,
be
maybe
all
even
right.
striking a compromise in between 4 and 1 additional lot, and maybe allowing 2 or something. I don't know, is
Yeah,
that,
4 is a lot.
yeah, 4 does.
4 is a lot, and I
yeah.
think it's a lot
is a lot.
for one person to make that decision.
Where do you measure the 300 feet from?
the 300 feet would be from, we calculate that in GIS, but it would take 300 feet from every portion of the entire boundary of the parcel.
So if you've got several, if there's going to be several lots, be 300 feet from that end and 300 feet to this end.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so it makes it, if you were just putting a dot in the middle, it might make a little different,
Okay, well, I still don't like
You
the
see how that
inconsistency.
goes?
And it does feel like fast tracking, and I don't like fast tracking. I mean, just for the sake of fast tracking, that's,
Yeah, I would also say that, the point of those public notices are to get input from anyone who wants to provide it. And so I don't know why, it almost seems like the impact would be you're wanting less input, and I don't think that's ever really the case, to make a decision, the more, if you have interested parties, you really do want to hear from them, and it just shuts some people out.
It shuts some
And I don't
people
know
out.
what that really accomplishes
And
as far as helping
And the
a decision
burden
to
is
be made.
really on the city, not on the applicant, or, right? I mean, to notice the people, so it's really, would reduce city expense or time to only notify people within 300 feet, but it doesn't really impact the property developer very much, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, that's usually built into the cost of a lot division is, all the postage for the notification typically. But
your public input for having one additional lot is likely to be less, because it's only one additional lot. If you have already an existing place and putting in 4 lots, or having 4 lots total, 4 or 5 lots total, whichever it is, then you're going to have more public interest, and I don't want to shut that out.
Where is the threshold of comfort, from your point of view, Mike, if you were the zoning administrator, in terms of making sort of an autonomous decision about the subdivision, whether, would it be 2 additional lots, would it be,
Well, I think we would stick with just what we had originally
1.
proposed. I mean,
yeah,
part of the issue is just the underlying record of the city. So if you go up to the county, I mean, you go through a subdivision plat, you're required to have a Mylar, it goes up to the assessor's records of, all the subdivision plats in the city. And, I mean, we look at Fort Russell and all these
Right.
other areas. I mean, they went through the subdivision plat process, and we have all those records of everything
Right.
that was
There's
recorded
a history that
at the
goes- yeah.
time. And there's the history. And you go through this process, and we require, we would require a record of survey, but that's not setting monumentation in the street. If there's extension of street rights of way, that's not setting monumentation in the street center lines. It is setting monuments on all the corners of the lots. But essentially what you get is, take the example of Southview, where Thompson's ended up doing the lot division to create, we had a rezone at Planning and Zoning, you might recall that, where we had Southview, and then it connected to Alice Street, and they went through Indian Hills 9th subdivision. And then there was the continuation of Southview on that boundary and an abutted Thompson property, and they rezoned that small portion and then divided it into 3 lots. Well, that included the extension of Southview, and then it created the 3 lots, and they just went through the lot division process. Well, if you end up looking at what it's going to look like in the records that we're going to have, or that you're going to have documentation that there was Indian Hills 9th subdivision, you're going to have this just one large parcel that's like a blank spot where there's a record of survey that's recorded against that property, and all it'll say is record of survey, and you'll have to look that up. And then presumably there'll be another larger subdivision when they end up coming in and platting all that other property there. So, I mean, in our minds, it's more or less the future documentation of the city as we move forward, and whether or not we want to have those gaps. I mean, if it's just a lot and it's in a subdivision and you're dividing it in half, that's not a big deal. But if you're
It's almost like a lot line
extending
adjustment.
yeah, if you're extending right away, and I mean, you're just going to have a gap in the city's fabric is what you're going to end up having. And so that was really why we were recommending that, I mean, based upon those two factors, just the coming down from 4 and having it be staff approval and what we felt comfortable with, as well as just the future, maintaining the.
Would there be more likely
Record of the
to
city.
have, to be disputes, or property line disputes with that process as
There
well?
could be. I mean, we would have a record of survey, and so that presumably would have, they're required to have pins set as part of that. So there will be property pins that would be recorded as part of that, but.
Okay. Other questions?
I have a question for Mike. If it went to the one additional, and in the case of 4, then would it just revert back to the existing process? Did I ask that clearly?
Mind repeating?
So, yep, if this change were to be made, that it would go through the zoning administrator for 1 additional. In the case of 4, would it then revert back to the current process?
No, we'd be getting rid of the current process.
Okay.
Anything over that you'd have to go through a subdivision plat.
Okay.
Which the process would be a little bit longer because you'd have preliminary and final plat that you would have to go through. But, I think the cost as far as preparing, a record of survey and a plat, as far as the documentation, are fairly similar as far as what they have to show with easements and all of that. So I think it'd just be an extended time, and probably a slight increase in the cost for a subdivision plat as opposed to a record of survey for a lot division. But.
Yes, Mike?
Mike, if we keep it at 1 lot and the notification distance is worked out, if they want to do 2 on that, then it goes back to what we traditionally do right now, correct?
No, we'd be getting rid of that. So with this
So
proposal,
there'd be no way you could put 2, 3, or 4 on that?
not without going through a subdivision.
That's what I mean, that was my question.
Not without going through a subdivision
So if it's
plat.
1, it can be
Yeah,
done by the zoning
yeah.
administrator.
So we're,
If it's anything over that will be
Yep.
done by
It's- Right.
perfect.
yeah.
It just seems to me that 4 additional lots is a subdivision.
Yeah.
In terms of
I
its
would agree
effect.
with you. I listened that day, but
Yeah,
it was, I wasn't real comfortable with
yeah.
it. Because there was sort of overwhelming support from the rest of the committee.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. We want to move on, or any more discussion?
I think we can move on.
The next one was where we talk about maximum block length. And we have, really nothing's changed a whole lot from our current code. I think it's 660 right now. But we did add this section about where the block length exceeds the 660. That pedestrian walkway connections should be provided. And it's usually kind of the parks, schools, commercial service, or other pedestrian destinations where we're looking at those pedestrian connections. Let's see, so this is on page 11. And they just wanted to add at the very end, flexibility for the council if there's certain circumstances. And I think it's, regardless, council always has the authority to deviate from code standards. So I think it's already inherent that council could waive requirements. But they just wanted it specifically stated at the very end that, you needed to provide these unless specifically waived by the council. And so they just wanted to have that clear that, it could be in some certain circumstances, maybe it doesn't make sense. So just adding that sentence at the end.
So adding the sentence is fine, but I know the council can waive, I've seen the council waive it under certain conditions. So
Yeah.
it doesn't need to be there, but if it makes them happy, it doesn't matter.
Sure. And then on that same page,
How long, let's go back to that for a minute. How long have we been saying inferring that a block is 600 feet?
That's a long block.
I don't,
Yeah.
I
It's a
mean,
double
this is
block.
a group of I don't know who was on the committee, but I don't like the suggestion that a typical block is 600 feet. I don't buy that at all. We've said in times past, if I'm not wrong, that on a dead-end street, on a cul-de-sac, we said it couldn't be longer than 600 feet. But I didn't know when we decided that blocks were 600 feet.
it's always been in the subdivision code. So the current code right now says blocks should not be longer than 660 between
the
street
maximum.
intersections. So it's always been in the subdivision code.
Always.
Yeah. I mean, you think about it, if you have a 50-foot wide lots, which are pretty narrow,
So what are the blocks in
that'd
Fort
be
Russell?
12, huh?
They're about
Around 300?
3 to 350. They vary, they're not necessarily square. I mean, yeah, so there's a short end and a long.
So when we talk about walkability, we're just kidding ourselves. We don't really mean it. We just are saying that 600 feet, I didn't realize that we've been saying that for a long time. I don't like it. I can imagine that we can say a maximum length, but we ought to recommend something better, in my mind. I don't know.
That's
Maybe
where,
I'm out to-
as we revise the subdivision code and we allow for more of a traditional form of development, that's where the blocks would be, the intersections would be more frequent. I mean, the advantage of shorter blocks is you have more choices as a pedestrian or driving or anything else. I mean, you have more avenues for connectivity. So we're sort of hitting the issue. I agree with you. It's always bothered me, actually, that we allow such long blocks. But the option is if somebody pursues a traditional development pattern, they can have shorter blocks.
When the contours of the land make it more difficult to develop without having longer streets, I can understand that. On the other hand, this tends to make it sound like blocks are 600 feet. And I don't know any city in the country that has 600, New York did 900 long blocks by like 250. So it was a very odd thing. But I don't know, I guess before I say any more, I'll go home and do some study on a map.
There's a great little article by Arne Sisk that I can hand out that compares block sizes of cities all over the place, all over the country and all over the world.
Okay. Well, anyway,
We can- but you're right.
I'm not happy with acting like 600 is something we ought to strive for. Maybe no one else has either thought about it, or you think I'm outlandishly unusual, but it's,
It has been there a long time.
yeah.
I agree with you that it's always bothered me, but we have, no.
I
um,
agree that 600 as any kind of standard is bothersome to me. I would point out that longer lot length, I suspect, lead to lower development costs. Less pavement, less sidewalks.
No doubt.
So I point out that we're making
Probably
a
true.
trade-off.
Yeah.
But I'll
There's
stop
a
at that
higher
point.
ratio, well, like the city of Portland has 200-foot by 200-foot blocks, and it does have more street to maintain as a
Yes.
result of that. Rob, you were
Well,
saying.
I'm, so that we don't get too far off track, what we're reporting on is the recommendations to the committee, and that wasn't a recommendation.
Right.
The only thing here that the committee was
Right, right.
recommending was, unless specifically waived.
Right.
We're gonna have an opportunity to talk about these issues as we get further into this revision that we're
Exactly.
doing.
Well,
So-
it's an opportunity to raise people's
I
awareness
agree.
about
Yeah, no, I
the
think,
issue, so, yeah.
but I guess I'm just
Yeah.
kind of thinking that we'll have another opportunity to
Yeah.
visit that particular piece of it.
That's exactly what I'd like to do, is raise our,
Awareness.
just
Yeah.
our awareness, to think about it a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah.
Yep,
Well, in point, the city of Manhattan, the standard block is 264 by 900, the city of Manhattan.
Yeah, and it's the
And-
only place in America that is anywhere near like
and that's where all the
City-
avenues are, the
Cindy,
retail avenues.
standard blocks across the US are 660 feet.
the what is?
The standard city block in most cities in the US are 660 feet. Right or wrong, I just
Is
looked
that
it
what
up.
that says?
Yeah.
I don't
So-
believe it.
Well, I didn't write it, I'm just reporting it.
Yeah.
But remember, it also says shall not exceed.
See,
Shall not be longer
it's
than.
max.
There you go.
And
So that's the
maybe
cap.
We need to find a way to, when we get to that point.
Well, so this is all about a suburb. It's not about a city. I mean, imagine a block that's 600 by 600. Try to imagine that. So really what it means is, we're calling it a block, but we're saying a street there should be 660 feet for every turn, but then you don't turn and go 600 again. You usually have two lots back to back, and if they're 100 or 120 feet deep, you end up with 260 60 feet. So anyway, we can talk about it more later. I'm just putting up a little red flag.
Okay.
Gosh, I feel really good about this.
And then we have, I don't know where this sentence ended up. It may have been carried over from the past, but just looking at lot lines, we've got the statement about how they should be at right angles or radial to the street lines unless a variation from the rule will give a better street and lot layout. Such variation must be approved by Planning and Zoning Commission. It's City Council that ends up approving it, so that was the comment there, that why do we have that if the council is the ultimate approver of subdivision plats, and so they proposed to just eliminate that. Then we talked about different types of lots, through lots, and then corner lots. And our reasoning, so they're right now corner lots, what the proposal would be is that if they're in residential zoning districts, have to be at least 10% greater than the minimum lot size of the applicable zoning district to ensure adequate building opportunities upon the lot. So this was really just our attempt to try to get the corner lots a little bit larger so we didn't spend so much time trying to help people house footprints on those corner lots, which we do a ton of. And they didn't like that was in there, and they thought that, we shouldn't be dictating the size of the lots.
And
that the
I
market
said
should do
that I didn't think they should spend city time, taxpayer money, to design for people who purchase lots that didn't fit the standard plans that they purchased. So, people go in and they use a lot of staff time to try to juggle and fit a house on a corner lot because it's undersized for the size, a house that may fit on the lot next to it but doesn't fit on a corner lot because the setbacks are different. And so why not make it 10% bigger so that you don't have that issue, and staff time could be better spent doing things for the greater good rather than the individual. I don't know. I was bothered by it. I sort of pushed back. I don't know. You were there too, Rob. You probably heard me do that. But
Well, corner
Yes.
lots have setbacks on two sides versus other lots, and so it needs to be a bigger lot. It's simple math as far as I
Yeah.
can see.
there was pushback. Is it a battle worth fighting? I don't know. But, I felt that it was an issue.
Wendy?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that if the commission has strong feelings about, and in consultation with Mike, that we should have something like that, we put it back in, even if the committee or the subcommittee said, well, we want it out. If we think it should go in, there'll be another opportunity when we go through public hearings on this
Right.
for somebody to object to it. So
Yeah.
I think that we shouldn't take as an absolute this committee's recommendation. So if we think it's important to have this in, then I think we should push for it, and there'll be opportunities to.
Yeah. I don't know how the rest of you feel, whether that, it's,
Well, like I said,
Yeah.
it's simple math, and when you talk about taking staff time to fix their problem, put it back in.
well, people do tend to purchase standard plans that aren't custom designed for a corner lot, and then it doesn't fit, so.
But people buy corner lots because they want those two sides, they want in their mind, they want the bigger lot. They want not having the neighbors on two sides, and there's a cost that comes with that, or a consequence, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
I put it back in.
From if I can articulate the developer's comments, it was that it just gives them more, that they can make anything work, that, it gives them more flexibility as they subdivide the land, right? I mean, that was basically the argument, from what I remember it.
Well, it was that staffs really shouldn't be helping them fit it on the lot. They should hire a design professional to do that for
Well, I would
them, to
agree
be
with
able
that,
to
yeah.
fit it on there. But, I mean, we're accessible, and that's what we do. I mean, we
Right.
provide customer service to people that come in, and that's one of the things that you don't get in Seattle.
Right,
You know,
no.
if you don't walk in the door with plans that comply, then you've got to walk away and come back in a number of weeks and try again. In our office, somebody comes in and wants to, try to fit something on a lot, we, in GIS, help them try to make that happen. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon, because, I mean, that's really, we're the size of community where we're accessible, and it's a good thing to do, to help people,
Right.
fit their plans to a lot, so.
Well, if it's a chronic problem that they're not able to fit their houses and need staff to help them do it, then I think we should keep it at
And
the
that-
10%.
you said you get a ton of them.
Yeah.
Well, more often than not, the corner lots are more challenging, because depending upon, I mean, once we start getting into the rolling hills, every intersection isn't at a 90-degree, it's at a curved, and you end up with these, lots that are odd shapes. And so that's when you end up, spending a bunch of time trying to make something fit.
Well, the planning part is to proactively catch things so that you don't have a problem, and not to take away the planning part that said have a bigger lot and go ahead and create the problem. So now we have to fix the problem. That doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Any other comment? And then there was just a couple minor things. So like under the development agreement section, we still had street tree obligation, which we've revised the street tree program, which isn't the responsibility of the subdivision developer anymore. It's the responsibility of the owner of the property. So we could just eliminate that, which made sense. And then there was just one more, I think on page 16, they just wanted it specifically stated. So under the public improvements required, it states currently, except as provided herein, all required, da-da-da-da. And they just wanted the specific section where it's stated, which is subsection C. And so that, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just more specific as to where it's located in the code, so. And that was pretty much it. I mean, they really liked the our cluster
Yeah, they did.
conservation subdivision and the traditional subdivision options. They really thought that that was a really neat and good thing to propose.
And we almost didn't have any discussion.
Yeah,
about
there
it,
was,
really.
yeah.
We were expecting it.
They were really excited about being
Yeah.
able to do that without having to go through a PUD. And, yeah, it was well received and really just positive comments on that, so.
That's great. Well, I want to go back to only one lot that you get to decide on, and I want my corner, 10% back on the corners. That's my discussion.
Yeah, those two items came out of our first meeting with them, and then the second one was, I think there was more consensus.
Well, we can, we have it in more of a draft format. We need to put it in legislative format, and we can work on doing that, and then you can think about it, and we'll just, I guess, keep it the way it is and then make the other easy changes, and then we can have a longer discussion once we've had a little bit of time to think about it, and you can see it in ordinance form, and we can talk about the block length and things like that.
I'll bring
at
in
that
a
time.
comparative, I have a perfect article that shows, that is a block study of, and it shows to scale the differences between.
Is it in paper, or is
It's
it
in
in digital? Do you have it digitally?
It is, yeah, it is, because
Or do you want me to pay for getting a copy?
No, it's digital because it's accessible, that it's in the first issue of Urban Morphology, so it's, but I was gonna try to just make it simpler than that article is, so, yeah.
Yeah, and I could do a comparison of some blocks in town,
Good.
if that would be helpful,
That would be good too, yeah. I measured many towns in the inland northwest, lots of railroad towns, mining towns, went around with the measuring wheel before everything was digital, measuring block lengths, because it really is a criteria that sets a quality environment. And when they're too long, you lose the scale, so. I've got many notebooks full of measurements of blocks. Anyway. Okay, so that's everything on that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that they liked the clustered and traditional.
Yeah, me too.
That's good feedback.
That was a positive
That's
thing.
good feedback.
Yeah. Okay, so are we ready to move on to item 6?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Regional Housing Needs Assessment Workshop Report. So Mike and Rob, I think, are both going to report on that. I was out.
two slides where they talked about city requirements, or not requirements, but kind of the to-do list.
Terrific.
Hey,
Hey, Lou.
But I didn't sit through the whole thing. I think Rob was there for the whole thing. I came at the end, but I know that the council went through the entire report, and then there was kind of a breakdown as to the group that was supposed to, formulate, and that what responsibilities they had, and then what responsibilities kind of the city was tasked with looking at. But, and that was really, there's 2 slides that kind of goes through those, but do you want to say anything, Rob?
Yeah, let me just jump in here and I'll go over here so I don't have to look down the. Victoria also attended at our last meeting. We talked about this report, the Palouse Regional Housing Assessment, and it was commissioned by the Partners for Economic Prosperity, PEP. And anybody that wants this copy is welcome to it. I've spent some quality time with it, so you can have this.
Have my own.
What we discussed was that we knew that there was an interest in having some additional discussion. That we knew that there was a workshop coming up by City Council, so we tasked me and Victoria with attending the workshop to see if we could report back to you so that we would have some sense of what impacts there might be to planning and zoning. So I'm going to do this very quickly, and we'll come back up to this. I'm going to do this backwards, starting with a conclusion, and then we'll talk a little bit about the workshop focus and the council discussion. But I don't see any current or near-term actionable items for planning and zoning. I think that we're in front of the issues that are of most concern. And Victoria and Brandy, jump in if you have any other items you want to put into the discussion here. But I think that there's a potential, and I'll come back to that we might have some issues that we'll want to discuss later on, or even potentially take some action. But basically, the workshop, there was a rather lengthy briefing on this report. Bill Belknap did that. And there's a lot of information that's relevant to us, and there's a lot that's not relevant either to us as planning and zoning or the community, because this is a regional study. So it's involving Pullman and Colfax and Elk River and Beauville, and so there's a lot of things that are issues cross-border, cross-state, cross-communities. So Bill was kind of trying to help us get focused on what was relevant to Moscow, and that's what we were really trying to get a handle on as well. So I think that the biggest thing that came out of it was this to-do list that Mike put up here. And the first thing that's going to drive everything is that PEP is tasked with putting together what they call a leadership group. And that leadership group is going to be 15 to 20 people. I don't think that it has not been formed at this point in time unless something happened between December 2nd and currently. It's possible that somebody from Planning and Zoning could have a spot on that leadership group. Certainly there'll be folks from the city, but there's also going to be people from Pullman, Colfax, all the counties. So this is a much broader issue than just for us. So I think that the to-do list is going to evolve. What we're going to do, what we're going to be tasked with, is going to evolve. And until we see what that leadership group comes out, and as they establish priorities, then we'll have a better sense of what it is that we're going to need to do. So that really, to me, is the first issue that has to be dealt with, getting that team. And there are some things that came up in the study that I think that we can prepare ourselves to be thinking about anyway. One of the things, and I'll just go through this really quickly, some of the council discussion issues. Certainly a priority was the leadership team. Council was talking about a perception that Moscow's not an easy place to do business. I don't know. I'm not sure where that would lead. There was a lot of talk about the city pursuing grants for infrastructure development, and that's going to relate to something I'll mention here in just a second, which is the notion of pre-zoning areas. And that's a real thorny issue. I have a feeling that at some point in time, we're going to be discussing that as a commission. But the idea is that you can help move the kind of development, particularly with focus on density, by pre-zoning areas. But that's a slippery slope. So that was something that came out of this report. This was not unique. It wasn't something that City Council brought out. That was brought out in this report. So another issue is encouraging higher density developments. I think that what we just talked about in the cluster development, we're working on those kinds of issues. One of the things that struck me was how well the commission has done in getting in front of these issues, and the city. I think that we're way more proactive than most of the other communities in the region are in dealing with these kinds of issues. So also in the workshop, council members were talking about the impacts of transportation on density, and while that's not directly related to us, certainly we'll be involved in that, I think, at some point in time, and I'm Transportation Commission as well. So incentives, I don't know exactly where that's going to go. Incentives for, it might be related to lowering fees. Certainly,
impact fees or
impact
something,
fees,
or
yeah.
essentially, yeah.
So I don't know exactly where that's going to go. One of the things, this second item, the zoning around the university, there was a talk about a student housing district, but my understanding from the briefing was that would not be legal in the state of Idaho.
That's what I heard too.
So I don't see that part is going to go anywhere. I don't know, Pullman might have a different issue. And then the last item, city can partner with housing developers to pursue grant funding. And affordable housing came out as a large part of this. And so I was trying to kind of understand what our role as a commission would be in affordable housing. And so there's a lot of intersecting interests in this. We'll be involved in some of them. The Affordable Housing Trust is certainly going to be, transportation is going to be. So I think, this is my opinion, I think that, and why I made the conclusion that we don't really have any current or near-term actionable items, I think we just keep working on what we're working, and it's going to dovetail with most of where this is going. And as that leadership group forms and sets priorities, then we'll stay engaged with them. And if we need to shift some of our roles and thinking or some of our priorities, we can do that too. So that's what I took out of, yes, sir.
When you went to the discussion, was with city council?
Yes.
And what do you think is the key thing that stimulated wanting this report?
Interesting. What I'm taking it is that affordable housing is the driving force for all of this.
One would think so.
And one of the criticisms about the report was that it focused, of course, remember, this is just an assessment, but it discussed every type of housing that is out there. Senior housing, larger single-family housing. Mike, you maybe help me, bail me out here, and some of the other
Tiny houses.
Tiny houses.
tiny houses
yeah.
was certainly an issue. They talk.
Yeah, modular houses.
So a couple of other quick things from my notes here is that there was talk about agri-hoods, they called them.
Yeah.
Tiny homes, ADUs. I think it was interesting because I think that we're in front of the ADU issue,
Correct.
where a lot of communities certainly aren't. modular houses was, and there was some criticism. People were wondering, if we're talking about affordable housing, why are we talking about large, single-family housing developments? Why are we talking about
Exactly, what was
seniors?
that
So,
about? Yeah.
I don't know where that's going at this point in time, but, so, I don't know. Mike, Brandy, anything else?
I would just add, I know that, so as far as where it all came from, it really, this study was commissioned by PEP, the Partnership for Economic Prosperity. It's a project that they wanted to do as relates to overall economic development in the region. They felt that having this assessment, that in part, better helps to understand and address attainable and affordable housing, just just the housing understanding in the region overall they felt an important piece of economic development, and they felt that was their role to do this. They came to several entities, including the city, asking to participate by partially funding this study. So it didn't originate from the city hiring someone to do this study, but the city did participate, as did the counties and other, Pullman and other entities, part of the university, I believe. So, and some of the discussion really was, looking at this report and questioning that what you said, well, I'm not sure that we need all the focus on more single dwelling as opposed to multifamily. So, and there was some, acknowledgement of that from Bill Belknap also, that, he's not so sure that that's the primary focus either, but, looking across the board, but perhaps the conclusions of this may be skewed in a way that it's eventually somehow determined that, well, that's not saying we're going to follow this as a plan. This says we need X number of these homes, so that's what we're going to do. It's just, those are the conclusions from this, and now I think it's up to our communities to determine which parts of that make sense and are valuable, and what do we take from it, and which parts maybe.
Yeah, I think part of the context that you bring up too is economic development is driving this, and part of the concern is that if your community doesn't have affordable housing, and it's really interesting what affordable housing gets defined as, but then you're going to have difficulty recruiting people in some of the tech sectors, for example, and other areas that are probably appropriate economic development areas in the communities. So they're really looking at this in the economic development context. So I think that certainly is a part of it. The other thing is that I think that we were talking about this in terms of where do we go now? And I think maybe it's a little early for us to know exactly what our next steps are until we hear a little bit more from this leadership group and see what pieces of it we can pull out of that, recognizing that this is going to be targeting a whole lot of other players than just us.
Well, I think I wasn't able to go to the workshop. Thank you for going and for giving us that summary. When I went through, I did read the report, and, I found some things very interesting. A lot of it is just out of our purview. And then there are some specific points where they say, this problem can kind of be addressed by planning and zoning commissions, throughout the report. And in a lot of cases, we've already addressed what's in there. And it did get, things like ADUs, as an example. I think we have been pretty proactive. So what kept plaguing me was this whole issue of affordability. They talk about how contractors don't want to work in this area because it's so hard to work with, the development process. I'm going, really? What's really going on is we had a recession. A lot of people went out of business. A lot of architects went out of business. A lot of developers went out of business. And then those that got regrouped went to places that were really growing and had enough. And maybe we do have a shortage of contractors, but I don't think it's because our process is screwed up. There were things that I started to just question. The other thing is just with, in terms of attainable housing, and the cost of housing, and needing to get under that 300,000 mark, there's a big gap. People want big houses. When it costs $200 a square foot to build a house, you know, they've got to start going back to the way it was when people had smaller houses. You see them all around town. And so the most affordable housing we have is that stuff that's already built, that's old, that's around. Really, not new construction, unless it's something like manufactured housing or, you know, some mass processed way. And that's where, you know, we have to decide what we want our community to look like, and that, maybe that's a way to, you know, address some of that need, I don't know. So we are addressing it through this current manufactured home.
And certainly, I would
ordinance.
encourage people to look at this. You really get down in the weeds with this report.
You do.
And sometimes it's easy to get lost in the weeds. I think, and Victoria, you jump in here too, I think my goal in going to the workshop was to find out what council thought we ought to be doing. And
Right, and-
that's, I think that Brandy, I think that for the most part, we're doing the kinds of things that council wants us to do. So I didn't see any new items that came
Yeah.
directly out of that. Certainly, we should be aware that there could be some coming down the road.
Right. Oh, that's good. I really
You know-
appreciate that you both went and.
So I have a couple things to say before you wrap it up. I agree. There's nothing for us to do right now other than what we're doing. The report acknowledges that Moscow has been proactive and is already working on a lot of things.
It does,
The
yeah.
leadership application things were closing the next day, which would have been the 3rd, and they planned to put that group together, Gina said, sometime in January, and that was the key thing to work. That group would have to work through things first before there would be anything concrete to work with. It is an economic focus, and so that's going to underpin, I think, it's going to have a bias, it's going to have an economic focus, and that's going to underpin things. I wanted to read what I think is one of the important sentences that is in this report. I have no idea where it came from, because when I have something this long, I just take screenshots and stick them on a Word doc so that I get the gems. So I don't know what page it was. But it said, issues that Moscow will need to consider are managing the placement of high-density housing, maintaining existing community aesthetics, and whether developers will need planned unit development processes or will be allowed to develop such housing by right in the appropriate locations. So that was something specific that they said. And I appreciate that when Bill gave the presentation, he applied it and to Moscow, which the report is very, broad. And he did pare it back
Right,
to
right.
Moscow. And a lot of it is out of our purview, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting, I mean, but hard, not,
Yeah.
I think it's out of the city's purview. I mean, developers, in a
And
sense.
they talked about,
yeah.
other states have incentives and tax incentives that Idaho does not have.
Mm-hmm.
And, you have to work within a legal structure.
Right.
I tried to print out the report myself, and I wouldn't suggest that I read it all, and I don't think I will. But as you look around the country trying to imagine, just trying to figure out what our real issue in, let's say, in Moscow is, you read in the newspaper that Seattle is going to spend a bunch of money for really deal with the affordable housing issue, and they got people laying around on the streets. I mean, it's under every overpass is people camping out. So I think Seattle's got the wherewithal, and they need to deal with it. The other place that deals with housing, that really attacks it, are places like Sun Valley and Park City, those resort areas where there's not a chance in the world that the guy that works, or the people that work in the ski area can afford a place. And so we just came back from Park City, and they're building, their city is actually building stuff that you can afford, and you have to jump through certain hoops and what have you. But it's hard for me to imagine, other than volunteer groups like Habitat and what have you, that there's any likelihood that there's something to do civically to do in a town like ours. I just, it's hard to imagine. I see places that can do it. I mean, they can raise, Park City can raise, if they need $1 million for something, all you have to do is talk to 5 people and you can get money raised. We're not that place. And so you just do wonder how, if affordable housing, and I think that, you know, if you want affordable house, you really have to go to Palouse or Troy, is basically the answer, and that means people who have to do that have to drive. They buy a cheaper house, and then they have to drive every day 40, 50 miles to get back and forth. So it's a kind of a no-win situation.
So at the workshop, Niels Peterson was there, and they asked him, as a Moscow Affordable Housing Director, what other entities would actually have a hand in it, and he said Habitat for Humanity as an example.
And I'm, you know, it's always lovely to help out Habitat, but gosh, they only build a house a year, you know, that's not a big deal, so.
And another thing is, tying into what you said, our location is far away from, I guess, the construction hubs, and so we lack having skilled labor in Moscow, and to attract skilled labor so that you would have people here that would not then cost so much.
Well, there's a
for
labor
construction.
shortage everywhere. I mean, you know, I've done a couple of projects on the west side, and it's just nuts trying to find anybody to do anything.
So, but I think
But
what you
that's
said
where
is
they
true.
are, you know, and it's west side of Washington. I mean, yeah, as wages are higher.
If you could bring the
know,
labor
yeah.
costs down, and that's getting
Yeah.
the skilled labor here.
Right, and that's not something that planning and zoning can really address. I felt I could see the issues, but I couldn't see things that, you know, were
Wendy.
like, aha, that's what we should do. Yeah.
Nils kind of brought this up peripherally, that one of the things that they started kind of getting off on a tangent was homelessness, which obviously is the huge problem in Seattle. But this report was never designed to address
No.
that issue. But the other thing, I say this with a certain amount of humor, parking came up.
Oh, yes.
And it's like, parking, I guess, comes up no matter what you're talking about.
It does. We all love our cars.
Yeah.
Well, and another thing that was brought up, and maybe Mike will cover it because it's up here, but they talked about reducing the cost of fees, and as Bill said, well, if you reduce the cost of fees, then you don't have the staff support anymore, because those fees aren't out there just going into a pot for jollies later on. They pay for the work that the
Right,
city
the
does.
impact fees
And
that somebody has to pay for
somebody
later.
has- yeah.
Like, you don't put in sidewalks, then, you know, 15 years later, they're gonna have to be put in.
So,
you
I
know,
mean, they're
by-
not just,
as
they're
an
there
LID
for
or
a
something.
purpose. They're there to
Yeah.
provide city work.
Right,
They're, you know.
so,
I might just comment on something that you said, Wendy, because that, about the, in the report about the feeling that it's difficult to do business in Moscow, because that specific question was asked, you know, where does that come from? I don't perceive that our process is particularly onerous, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So I think there, you know, my sense is maybe someone in this group that maybe is in the developer or realtor side, I'm not sure, but, you know, has that feeling, and it got put in the report, and that maybe it's something from the past, and that one of the goals for this group would be to try to reach out, like you talked about the recession, to these builders who've moved on to the more booming areas like Coeur d'Alene, and said, okay, now come back.
Back,
We've
yeah.
got a lot going on here and take another look, but not necessarily that they were driven away because Moscow was too difficult to deal with, but more those other factors where there was just no building going on for a period of time during that recession.
Well, a lot of people, I know, when I was full-time at the university and we were, and the recession hit, and, you know, there was this big argument that, oh, the need for architects is just going away permanently. And the Bureau of Labor and Statistics was already talking about the construction industry coming back by 2014, and that there would actually be a shortage in both labor and professional services, et cetera. And that's exactly what's happened. I mean, you know, and it's always been cyclical, but, and so I feel like we're still feeling that effect of sort of hemorrhaging of skilled labor. I don't know, you, Scott, you know.
Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, tell us.
What's your take on it? You're way closer than we
Yeah,
are.
it's a little brutal right now.
Yeah.
It is. The construction trades, everybody's starving for labor.
Yeah.
And it's driving the price up.
Yep, yeah.
We're seeing architects' estimates getting blown out of the water. And a lot of that's due to the labor costs.
Yeah.
Supply and demand.
Right.
Because you think there's not a body of labor to do the things that need to be done.
Correct.
And you have a hard time finding people.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Skilled tradesmen are very difficult.
So how do you create new affordable housing, or attainable housing, not even affordable, I mean, kind of where people have a moderately good job or combined incomes that normally could afford a house, but the cost of new construction is just, you know, yeah.
You almost need more lots, in my opinion. Affordable lots, how do you get them? Clusters, whatever, but, you know, right now, lots are expensive, so.
Right. So there's yeah, okay, well, anyway.
There was some discussion on the Moscow not being business-friendly as being an old thought that just seems to keep rolling forward, and I don't see the evidence for.
An old what?
An old thought that just
Oh.
keeps rolling forward. And there was some discussion about sometimes these things come from somebody has a bad experience. And so they'll never work with the city again, and then they tell somebody, and don't work with the city, you know, and so that kind of snowball effect happens too.
Yeah, it's like the UI as a drinking school. I
Yes.
get that all over the state. I used to hear that everywhere, and really?
Well, do you think,
Yeah.
Scott, do you think, to mention an evil name, do you think Boise would be more friendly to development?
Boise
In other
is so
words- in other words,
expensive. It's
what
gone
we're
up.
looking at is,
Yeah.
we're looking at a little town that has, we're lucky to grow 1% a year. Boise, on the other hand, has grown for 30 years at 3% a year, which is, you know, you would think that people would flock to Boise because there must be jobs around every corner. You wouldn't flock to Moscow thinking there's a job around every corner, because we're, you know, the business community isn't levitating. We don't have, every now and then I make this speech that, you know, we don't have water, and we don't have a freeway, and we don't have an airport. Well, duh, who would come here if you don't have any of those three things? And, in other words, yeah, you can go to Seattle, I get that. But people who have an airport can go in 10 different directions. Excuse me, I know, you're gonna hold it against me.
Would you like to sit closer?
No, we're fine. Keep it separated.
Yeah, so like you say, there's really not much in here for us,
Not for us
probably.
right now.
I think they identified too that we're, I don't know how you phrase it, land poor, lot poor. We don't have the land to develop. so that does force high density.
We have the land, is that, I mean, it's,
Not allowed lots.
but we need developers to pull the trigger on the developments.
When,
Yeah,
I was just gonna see if Mike had anything he wanted to offer from the
yeah.
city perspective.
Yeah, good
Oh, yeah.
point.
I may have
Yeah, your
missed.
slides.
No, I think you covered pretty much everything. I don't really have
Oh, yeah.
much to add.
Well, it seemed like one statistic I pulled out of here was that you want a buyer's and a seller's market is balanced if there's a 6-month supply of housing. And we're at like 3.9% or something. So we are under, it's more of a seller's market, buyer's market right now. So there is a gap. But what's causing, how you fill that, I don't know.
There was a comment too about, because their projections were close to having, or even having a little more available housing than people they project will need. But you don't want to have it so tight that, okay, one house came up, everybody grab, somebody's going to get it. You have to have more housing available so there's choice.
Right,
So
yeah,
there's
so it's a
selection.
6 months, that's a
that's-
balance, that's what I'm
that's
saying,
the
it's a
6 month-
balanced
okay.
market, whereas I bet you in Seattle, there's a 1-month supply, if that, maybe a 3-week, 2-day supply, I don't know. I mean, it's really
But I
bad.
think certain price
Yeah.
ranges here
Yeah.
are less than that. I mean,
Yeah.
for existing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it's
They're all 800,000.
crazy when a house comes on the market that's in
Yeah,
a
I-
fairly little price range.
Yeah, we've been
Hitting
We
seeing
see
more.
anything under about 280,000 will sell in under a week in our neighborhood.
Well, I take to heart the
Just like that.
PUD we had, which was no bloom, right, on Indian Hills Drive? Was it Indian Hills Drive or South? Yeah, I don't know, over there by the Ag Building.
Oh, yeah, Indian Hills.
Indian
Drive,
Hills
yep.
Drive, okay, and the PUD we did. And I asked him why that qualified for a PUD, because that's a special case. And he said that it used to be apartments for students, and we are now finding that people can't find housing. Regular people who have jobs and families can't find housing, and they're moving into apartments. So there's a need for these smaller homes for families, or young professionals or whatever.
Yeah.
And those are single-family homes. They're not the giant ones on the giant lots. But that's what what I think I am seeing identified as a need.
Well, if the gap is between 100 and
There's the
300,000,
gap.
you're not gonna get a large house on a large
Right,
lot,
right.
unless you go
And
20
he said
miles
they
out
were-
of town.
They were shooting for 260, maybe 280, but trying to keep it
Yeah.
down to 260.
Yeah.
And so I take to heart what he told us. Yeah, there's a lot of apartments. Everything says we're overbuilt for apartments. But part of the reason is that there aren't the homes that people can afford, and they wind up in apartments. But that's not where they want to be.
He was showing that, wasn't the, was it Green Acres and?
Temple
like,
Compo-
Yeah,
Temp-
that those were originally kind of more reasonable, and, I actually asked, well, what do those go for now? And it was like,
Yeah, they
over
went way up.
300,000. I mean, they're not, it's, so they started as this higher density, smaller lot, shared kind of space, but in the last 10 years or however long it's been, that their prices are now,
Yeah. Shot up.
yeah,
Shut up.
yeah. So I don't know if it's the whole cluster development. I mean, I think the planning and zoning is on the right track with, and
Between
maybe
homes
in
and the
conjunction
townhouses
with
and
if-
everything.
Yeah, if the group can come up with some successful, getting some grants or something to do some more creative, like there were some great examples in that report too, in other communities of specific little neighborhoods that are a little more creative, if you can get some grant funding for it. And there's some discussion about sort of land set aside too, trying to identify and where these projects could happen, but.
To your comment, Niels Peterson, I don't remember if it was the counselor here, because he's talked to both, talked about shooting for building affordable housings, and about the time he had that figured out, price shot up the next year. So by a lot, you know, so it's what you're saying, they keep going up, and you can't, you know, how do you get it back down again?
Well, the cost of labor and materials is up there, so I don't know. It's a hard one. Well, thank you, everybody who contributed to that discussion. We appreciate it, yeah. Item 7, Joel, Transportation Commission meeting report. You meet tomorrow?
Transportation Commission is meeting tomorrow at 4 in this room. 3 items that I would highlight, I see on the agenda, not that I know much about them yet. One is a report on the bicycle counts, which the city has done on 3rd Street near Hayes and near Blaine. They're counting bicycle and pedestrian traffic. So it'll be interesting to see what they've come up with and see whether there's any alteration due to the pedestrian bridge. The second item is a report by Vitruvian Planning.
Looking at Glass Academy.
Yeah, at any rate, the report is of a workshop, the Looking Glass Academy, neat name. But basically, it was sponsored by the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, and using money related to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And the idea, as far as I can figure out, looking at some of the material, is to look at impediments as indicated by whatever one sees on a walking tour, and related to people's access to food. And I guess I would reduce that to whether or not you can figure out how to get down to the farmer's market on a Saturday, or just general access to sources of food. So see what that looks like tomorrow. The third is what I've been waiting for. E-bike and e-scooter moving toward some regulations and policies for the city. So we'll see where that goes.
Interesting.
The mobility.
We have some devices on campus, I believe. Don't we? Or have they been delayed? But at any rate,
Well, there was that whole bike program.
We're getting some,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're
I think
getting
it's
some.
I think they're scheduled to be arriving like
Yeah.
April or May. I
Yeah.
think it's the Gotcha Bike Share Program, but they don't have scooters yet. It's only e-bikes.
Testing
or,
with bikes first.
Right.
But it was delayed because they couldn't get the bikes. I mean, I think it had to do with tariffs or, yeah.
Company,
Yep.
yeah.
No, I was up in Spokane last week, and there were lots of both scooters and bicycles in evidence.
Yeah. Well,
So the mobility report, we took that workshop last summer, was summer before?
right.
That
No,
didn't
it was
have
this-
anything
it
to
was
do
this
with
last
food,
May, yeah.
but we did the mobility report. So the examples were things that we did on the walking tour.
Yeah, there were a number of intersections that we looked at, and they just have a number of recommendations as to, how to improve some of those. Like there's a crosswalk by the Corner Club on, how to improve the safety of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Suggestion of an additional
There's a lot of those.
crosswalk near the high school and the
Yeah.
1912 Center, I
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah, there was some
Well, as
recommendations
perhaps
about the two-way bike lane that's proposed on Third, and, there's some conflicts with, as you know, the 1912 Center. A lot of the loading and unloading happens right there on Third, right in front, just
Yep.
because it's plaza level, so you don't have to go up or down stairs, and you can walk in out of the great room. And so they had some recommendations there as to alternate loading locations for them. So, yeah, it was just a number of intersections and some other areas that we looked at on the walking tour, but.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Joel. Any announcements, Mike, or from staff or anything?
None from staff, other than the treats from the mayor we got
Oh,
here.
yeah, thank you, Mayor Lambert, for our Christmas treats there. Okay, I guess meeting adjourned, thanks.